Good morning. Clearly, I am not Chuck Bartlett, so he is out of town this week. Him and Debbie. There's a weekend meeting. I believe it was Alabama, but don't hold me to that. But he's down there this weekend, so I'll be filling in for Bible class this morning. I think Mark has preaching this morning. I believe Tony's got it this evening. So before we get started, we'll ask Dustin if he would to lead us in our opening prayer.
God, we come to you now. Thank you for another day that you blessed us. Thank you for another time that we have to come together as Christians and study your word. We pray to God that we take the lessons that are taught today and we apply them to our lives. That as we go out in this world, we shall teach it, spread your word to try to bring others souls to you as well. We just ask that you get those who are not with us today, those who are traveling, those who are going through physical illnesses, we just pray to give them, bring them back to us. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the many blessings that we enjoy. We know that we are truly blessed and it's all come from you. We're especially thankful for Christ Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. We know, dear God, that it is that sacrifice that allows us the opportunity to have one day to and for all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. So if you're wondering what the abundance of screaming at the back is, the little kids class is all gone today, and they're trying to do the little kids class with the little kids that will be going in there in the next couple of months. So clearly there's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period there. Or it could be that there are other options to sit out here with me. All right, so James chapter 1. I'm not going to pull up the PowerPoint this morning. No need for it. But we started last week 12 through 18, and we kind of just hit the tip of the iceberg there. Now, Chuck's big request to me was to go through this super slow. He said he didn't want to come back and have us in chapter 5. I don't think that's going to be an issue because I know there's some stuff in here that he was really wanting to cover and looking forward to covering. So don't be surprised if next week we kind of go back through a little bit of this again. But James chapter 1, and we're going to start in verse 12, and we're going to read 12 through 18, and then take it verse by verse, and discuss it. So, Janet, if you don't mind, read 12, and then we'll do 2 verses at a time, all the way down through 18.
Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone.
But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death.
Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created.
Okay, so 12 through 18 here, we kind of started on this last week, and I think we got into 13, but we're going to kind of start back at verse 12 again. So first things first, what's this dealing with here? What's this talking about?
Temptation and sin.
And there's a common misconception in not just today's world, but even back then, because it's addressed, that who all is involved in temptation? First off, what's the misconception of who all is involved in temptation? God, us, and I think it's pretty safe to say everybody agrees the devil is involved in temptation. But from what we read here, who do we know is in fact not involved in temptation? God. So why do people think that God is involved in temptation? Now, this is kind of strictly speculation here, but what are some of the common things out there that people believe why it happens?
Well, you're going to notice, in a lot of our culture and media, they portray temptation as a choice between the little angel and the little devil. So it's easy to make that mistake by saying we have two
Do you necessarily not have two forces though? Because you kind of, in a sense, don't you kind of have two? God's not. You don't have one on one shoulder, one on the other, but you do have good and bad. You do have a choice. But Mark's right. There's not somebody sitting there in your ear. Hey, do this. No. Hey, don't do this. Nancy.
Well, a lot of people think God's tempting us by testing us. Or it's testing us by tempting us, which he doesn't do.
Right. So, what is God's role in temptation? He does have a role in temptation. What is? He allows it to happen. That's all it boils down to. It doesn't mean he does it. Doesn't mean he tempts us. It just means he allows it to happen. EJ, do you have something?
Don't isn't there somewhere, well, in the world that people can do something wrong and they in front of the judge and they come talking about God made them do it, they done kill somebody because I read that God should not kill, but then they said God told me to kill or God made me kill. They lie on him.
I mean, there's all kinds of people out there that say stuff that, so and so made me do it. There's people out there that will say stuff like that. And I mean, you think about any number of things. There are people that say, to EJ's point, that say the devil made me do it. Well, did the devil make them do it? No, the devil may have tempted them to do it or encouraged them to do it, but the devil didn't ultimately do that. But then you also see throughout history and even today, there are a number of people out there that are doing things in the name of God. Terrorism, for example. One of the big things that they say they're doing is in the name of Allah or in the name of God. And is that what God wants? No. Is God making them do that? No.
And knowing that God allows it to happen, we also have to keep in mind that He only allows as much as we can handle. I mean, and that is different for everybody.
Right. And we can't mistake God allowing that to happen to God tempting us. Because as men, we have what? Choice, free will. And we spent a whole quarter at least talking about that last year or year before last with the study in Calvinism of what God allows to happen as opposed to what God, predestination and all of that stuff. Somebody else had. Warren?
Well, I think this idea of temptation is different for each and every one of us. I mean, I think that's a huge factor. What I'm tempted with, you may not even consider temptation.
Right.
So I think that's a big piece of that. We struggle with things that I think everybody does. That they're different, but they're still temptation.
Absolutely. So, and we did kind of get into that last week about, the different types of temptation. And Chuck talked about, foul language. He's like, or alcohol. He's like, that's not something that tempts me. But it may be something that tempts me or tempts you. And the same temptations that you have may not be the same temptations that I have. So, second question to that, kind of follow up that we also talked about a little bit last week is there anything wrong with temptation? No. Why not?
It's not sin.
Because it's not sin?
Jesus was tempted. If temptation is bad, sin, then Jesus sinned, but he didn't. So. Exactly.
So temptation is not sin. Temptation is. Anybody know what the definition of temptation is? Lure. So I looked it up, and the definition is the desire to do something, especially something wrong or unwise. I think that especially something wrong or unwise is something that's kind of thrown in there because oftentimes we do put temptation with evil things, but who among us this morning wasn't tempted by all the Easter candy probably laying around your house? Is that a bad temptation? Could be if you look like me, but there are temptations out there that aren't bad. Tempted to do things that aren't bad. You could be tempted to do something that may be even good for you. I'm tempted to take on this new project at work or undergo this. I'm tempted to go back to school. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but there is a desire there. There is a lure there, as EJ was saying, to do that. So temptation isn't always a bad thing, which goes to prove temptation in itself is not sin. And I think it's important to establish that because should we feel guilty for being tempted? No. There's nothing wrong with being tempted, but if you think about that, so when it comes to the evil things or the sinful things, what should temptation actually be to us? If we're tempted by something, what should that be to us?
A red flag to leave the other way.
Test, red flag, a warning of if there's something I know I shouldn't be doing, but I'm kind of tempted to do that. Should I even flirt with that? Should I even be on the line of that? No, not at all. And so if there's something, if you find yourself, you go out to a restaurant with coworkers one night and everybody's having drinks and having a good time, and you find yourself, well, I'm kind of tempted to have a few drinks myself. There's your red flag of, okay, I need to make sure this is a temptation for me. I need to make sure in the future I'm completely avoiding this and not putting myself in the situation. Dave?
When we have temptation come away and we avoid it, then it makes us stronger in faith.
It does. It makes us stronger in our faith. But kind of along those lines, so let's say that instance, I'm out at a restaurant with coworkers on a business trip. Everybody's got some drinks in them, having a good time, and I find myself tempted to do that. If I resist that, does that mean, okay, I'm good for, I can regularly come back and do this on a regular basis now?
That's the wrong atmosphere for a Christian to be in the first place.
Well, I'm saying if you're at a restaurant, there are restaurants that serve. You're not necessarily at a bar, but there are people you go out to eat and somebody's going to have a drink. But no, that's a situation where just because you overcome that temptation doesn't mean, goes back to what Janet was saying, it's a red flag. Doesn't mean that, hey, I overcame this temptation. I can handle this. Doesn't mean that you can put yourself right back in a situation like that in the future. Let's go Nancy, EJ, then Janet. Do you have something, Nancy? Okay. EJ?
You know, what you saying, if you were in a restaurant, if it's two, if you're strong-minded or you're weak-minded. But some people have a sense of humor about like me. Now, I have been in a situation like that, just like I told them. I have a Coke and y'all can smile, because when you get drunk, I'll take you home. I'm not drinking, I don't drink, I want to live, not liver damage. And they respect me for that, because just because they jump off a hill, don't make me jump off a hill too.
Right. And so, sometimes these things they're unavoidable. I know I've had work events before where when you get there at the work event, they give you a couple drink tickets. Like, this is a meeting. You have to be at this meeting. You can't miss this meeting. But like you said, doesn't mean I partake of it. Once the meeting's over with, if that's a temptation for me, I need to be gone, and I need to make sure I'm not participating in these things. That there are times in our life where the sin around us is unavoidable. We live in the world, but we're not to be what? Of the world. Janet?
Just the example you gave, if you're sitting there and maybe you're doing it 2-3 nights in a row because it's a 5-night conference, whatever. I mean, even though you're visiting church and they maybe somebody at the next table saw you, that they don't know you. Well, he was drinking it. The perception
Right.
of the people around you that you might come across.
Right. And that's another thing. You definitely have to be careful of where you're at, and make sure, do your best to avoid those situations when you can. But there are going to be times where it's unavoidable to at least be there and be around it. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so going verse by verse here, looking at verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So, blessed are those who endure. David, if you would, open up to James over just a couple pages, chapter 5, verse 11. And then 1 Corinthians 9 and 25. Greg, if you would, read that. And then Matthew 10:22. And we're going to look at all three of these verses. And I love James chapter 5, verse 11, especially because I like skipping ahead to what Chuck's going to be teaching in a few weeks and going ahead and talking about it. So, David, if you would, James chapter 5, verse 11.
Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful.
Okay? So what do we see there that relates to verse 12 here? Blessed are those who endure. Why are those who endure blessed? Amy?
Endurance is no one-time thing. It's not something that I said, no, once I've endured. No, endurance is something you have to build up and build up and build up. And so endurance implies a long time. So that's time after time after time of enduring that temptation and being successful in it.
So why are they blessed?
They haven't given into that sin.
Right? Right. So what makes them blessed though? What's the thing that they're going to get for that endurance? The crown of life. So that right there is the blessing. That's why they're blessed. That endurance, to Amy's point, as you endure something, think about, if you're running a race or working out, the first time you go work out, how's your endurance level? Not very good. But the longer you keep going and keep going and keep going, what happens? That endurance level build, and build, and then at the end, you're going to get that reward. 1 Corinthians 9:25.
Not everyone who completes exercises self-control in everything. However, they do it to receive a crown that will fade away, but we a crown that will never fade away.
Okay, so kind of back to the point we were just talking about with the exercise. You run these races, you may get a medal or you may get a T-shirt. What's going to happen to that one day?
It's going to be worn out.
It's going to be worn out. It's when it turns into a really soft jammy shirt for at night. But then, that medal, that certificate, whatever, it's eventually going to go away. But the endurance that we're talking about here, what happens to that endurance? Correct. Unperishable crown. And then Matthew chapter 10, verse 22.
You will be hated by all on account of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end will be saved.
Okay, so again, we see what is the reward for that endurance. Salvation. Will be saved. And there's something else that's mentioned in there. What's the first part say? You'll be what?
Be hated by all on account of my name.
Be hated by all on account of my name. So kind of back to what we were talking about before when we were talking about sometimes you're in a situation where you can't avoid some of the things going on around you. I saw a lot of heads nodding. I think we've all had work events where we've been there. You ever had somebody that maybe gets a little upset with you that you're not participating in some of those things? You ever been to college and had people that get upset with you that you don't go out and party with them every Friday night till the wee hours of the morning? That's what this is talking about here. Is it the most popular thing to do? When everybody's around you drinking and having a good time at the that's why they hand these drink tickets out at different events, is to get everybody loosened up, get everybody mingling and networking and all that stuff. And when you're not participating in those things, it's not the most popular thing. And a lot of times it may make mad, like, oh, you think you're better than me, goody two shoes, and they'll call you names and try and tease you and taunt you. It's not the popular thing to always do. And think about church this morning. We're here every Sunday. I look out, most of the faces I see in here are here, every single Sunday morning. You ever had somebody try and get you to go fishing, go play golf, go to a ball game? It's a beautiful day outside today. And after the weather we've had this week, it'd be a great day to go tee it up and play some golf. But when you turn those things down, is that the popular thing to the world? No. And you may have friends that feel like you're kind of leaving them out to dry when you don't do those things. All right. Moving on, verse 13 here. Anybody have anything on verse 12? Anything additional? All right. Verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. So we kind of already touched on this, but I do want to flip over. Tony, if you would, go to Job chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 6 through 12. So anytime you talk about temptation, where's the book you want to go to? It's Job. It basically says all you need to know in terms of temptation, God's role in temptation, the devil's role in temptation, and man's role in temptation. So, Tony, if you would, read chapter 1, verses 6 through 12.
Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
Okay. So here we get a first-hand account of how temptation works. We get a first-hand account of the relationship of God in temptation, the relationship of the devil in temptation, and as you read further in the book, where man comes in temptation. Because even we see Job even tempted by his fellow man, even his wife, his own wife tempted him to curse God and die. So and we kind of already talked about this, what were the roles here? What was the role of the devil first? So he came and basically asked for permission to tempt. What's the role of God? He allowed it to happen. One thing I find interesting here is in verse 11. This is the devil speaking, "But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." So who's the devil talking to there? So what's the devil telling God to do? Right. Does God do it? No. And it's a verse that can be easily just kind of glanced over because we know the rest of the story and how it plays out, but I don't think it's an accident. It almost seems kind of like a little jab from the devil there of trying to get God to do it. But as we can see, it doesn't faze God. God allows the devil to go about it and do his business, but God does not do it himself. So the story of Job kind of brings up a good point regarding temptation and everybody's kind of role in it. When you think about the world today, what would Job's status have been, financially speaking? Very wealthy. Lots of kids, good household, very well off. In today's, a lot of times in not just today's society, but even back then, what do people tend to equate riches, wealth, blessings with? Favor with who? With God. So the devil's basically saying, hey, you've given him everything. You've built this hedge around him. I bet if you take this away from him, then he's not going to be on your side anymore. So it's a good example, and it's a good lesson for us. And I'll even say for me in particular, when I have, am I as wealthy as Job was? No. But I have more than I could ever, hope and dream for. But how frustrated do I get when something goes wrong? And when I can read Job and everything that he went through, the deaths, he had everything taken from him, and even had his own wife turn against him, and his terrible friends turn against him. At that point, he had nothing and he had nobody in life. But he realized this isn't God doing this. He realized that, like we talked about earlier, all this stuff that he had was perishable. But he realized there was something imperishable in the end that was worth fighting on for. All right, so now looking at verse 14, back in James chapter 1, But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. All right, so this is actually where I had the definition of temptation written down. So, anybody find anything interesting about this verse? Anything that stands out to you? Amy?
Being drawn away by your own desires, like things you already have, like whether it be drinking or smoking or cussing or whatever. That's something you're already tempted by, and it's used against you.
Right. So these are our desires. This isn't like the devil's inventing something new to put before us and try and pull us away. Like the temptation that we have, the temptation that we face is of our own doing. And again, going back to that, temptations in and of itself isn't wrong, but we have to examine where is that temptation coming from. We can't just put the blame, like we talked about earlier. I think it was Warren's point earlier. We can't just blame the devil. The devil made me do it. Like, we did it. It was our own desire and our own temptation. Warren?
Well, I think it's a good passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13.
Okay, go ahead and read that for us.
No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear.
There you go. And the other thing, I think, one thing I really like about that passage, I'm glad you brought that up, is throughout this whole thing, who's in our corner? God. And it reminds me yesterday, we were at the park and we had Sawyer and he was playing, and the kid will try and climb anything to the point, like if you turn your head for a second, he's up the side of something and you don't know how he got there. And there's this ladder there that's on these chains and it's got these boards that go across it, and he wanted to try and climb it. Well, Mama's instinct was immediately, no, you can't do that. Well, Dad's a little more lax and it's like, let's see what you can do. And so he kind of started up it, and I'm right there behind him the whole time. Now, he knows I'm behind him, but he doesn't necessarily put two and two together that Dad's here if something goes wrong. And so he goes up a step, and he kind of looks around, and then he goes up another step, looks around again, and he goes up another step, and he's like 2 steps from the top, and he just locks up. And he's sitting there, and he doesn't think about, Dad's right behind me, nothing's going to happen, he's got me, but he just locks up, and all of a sudden he goes, help peace, help peace, help peace. And that was his high. That was as far as he made it. So I grabbed him and took him off. He could have kept going. And if something happened, I'm not going to let him do anything that he can't handle. I'm not going to let him get in over his head. And that verse tells us the same thing about our temptation. Yes, God's going to allow us to be tempted, but he's not going to allow us to be tempted more than anything that we can handle. And so we should take solace in the fact that we know he's in our corner. And even when we're going through these things, even when we're going through these trials, struggles, and temptations, we've still got our Father there with us, making sure that, hey, I'm not going to let anything overcome you that you can't handle. All right, verse 15. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So what does it mean, desire has conceived? What does that mean? So what's the desire that we've been talking about? Temptation. So when it's been conceived here, we're talking about we've committed sin. So now we see the result. So far we've talked about temptation, what it is, who all's involved, but now we see the result of said temptation. And what is that result? Death. That's spiritual death. Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes it could be, death, yeah. And that's one thing we talk about is there are earthly consequences to sin. Can be, not always, but there can be earthly consequences to sin. But we do know there are spiritual consequences to sin, even if there are no earthly ones. You may get away with it, no problem, no questions asked, but it will catch up to you. And we talked about that reward that we strive for, a perishable or an imperishable crown, that's taken away when we allow that temptation to become sin. Look over, where did we get to? Mary Ellen, if you would, Romans 5:12.
Therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sin.
Okay. So, where did death enter the world, both physical and spiritual? What caused death to come into the world? Adam and Eve. That's what caused physical death. That's what caused spiritual death, was that temptation becoming a reality. And then flip over one more chapter to chapter 6, verse 23. And Jim, you mind reading for us?
23.
Yes, sir.
For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord.
Okay, so again, we see the wages of sin is death, and we look at a couple different verses there to see that's the consistent message delivered throughout the Bible, that here's the consequences that you're going to face. All right, looking at verse 16, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. How could we be deceived? First off, who could? Amy?
We might fool ourselves into thinking, it's not I've said no once, it's not a temptation to me anymore.
Okay. And that's kind of like back to, I think it was Nancy's point earlier, that said just because you say no once, or just because you overcome a temptation, doesn't mean, oh, this is never gonna affect me anymore. And there are people that come to God out of the world as adults, and they may have lived a very rough life up to that point. Well, it's not a switch that flips that, okay, I'm a Christian now, I won't have any more temptation, and this isn't, whatever has been a struggle of mine in the past is no longer going to be an issue of mine. There's no magic button or switch that flips that eliminates that. So we can't fool ourselves that, okay, now I'm a Christian, this isn't going to be a struggle anymore. Misty?
I do think that passage that do not be deceived is continuing on in that next verse, where the deception is that God caused this, not you're blessed and the devil caused this. And I think that's the thing that most of us miss, maybe even most of the world misses, is that it's not God that causes the temptation, it's other sources.
Right. It's other sources. And we've talked about those. It's us, it's the devil. There's a myriad of people and things that can be involved in that, but God is not one of them. Okay, verse 17, kind of to Misty's point here, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. So, Misty, if you would, look over at Numbers chapter 23. Numbers 23, and if you would, read verse 19.
God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good?
Okay, so what do we see here? God does not what? Doesn't sin. He doesn't lie. So we can, all this stuff that we've read, we can know that it's the truth, because God doesn't lie. God cannot lie. And the other thing is, what God says, He will do. So if we talked about that perishable crown, that imperishable crown can be taken away from us. And God says it can and will be taken away from us. So if He says that, what do we know? Yeah, you can hang your hat on it. You can take your check to the bank and cash it. Like, if that's what He says, that's what He means, and that's how it's going to be. And I think Chuck kind of touched on this a little bit last week. What's a common thing people like to say today about God, Judgment Day, judgment in the end? What's something people like to say? Nancy?
There's a lot of people that think everybody's done.
Yeah. Mark?
A lot of them think fall into the false notion that he can't do the American life. He'll change it.
Right. And so that's a very prevalent belief out there. And it's you ever had a test graded on a curve during school? So if you don't know what that means basically nobody did good on the test. Bad enough that the teacher is like, okay, we're going to take whoever got the top score, bump them up to a 100, and however many points is between that score and a 100, everybody's going to get that many points added to their test. Nothing you love hearing better than that, especially if you were a student like I was. You loved hearing, I'm going to do this one on a curve. And that's kind of what we've built as a society is, everybody's going to be graded on this curve, and that's not the case. It's happy to think about that, hey, in the end, and God can. If God wants to, he could save everybody in the end. But if he does that, what does that make him? A liar. And we just read that God is not a liar. So that's something that, like I said, it's a common belief and a common feeling in the world, but we know that is not the case. I saw a hand over here.
I was going to say, the flood and Noah gives us just a glimpse at the resolve of God and the destructive power that he possesses. Because we don't know how many people are on the face of the earth, but if it's 10,000, 100,000, million, we know just Noah and his family was saved, so that means he wiped out all of them. He's quite capable of doing what he says.
Yeah, he's, it's like the saying goes, he's done it before, he'll do it again. And he tells us as much. And like I said, based on what we read earlier, we can, hang your hat on that. Misty?
Well, you think about every good and perfect gift coming from God, well, that has to mean that all this other stuff doesn't. You think back to the beginning to Adam and Eve. He gave them everything. They were in the garden. He just told them not to eat of this one fruit, and that temptation to eat. They weren't thinking about, and maybe they just didn't realize, I don't know, but they weren't thinking about all the things that they would lose, such as their place in the garden, such as death, such as having to work. All those things came about because they gave into that temptation.
Right, exactly, and that's what brought forth the death and the punishment that we just talked about in the last verse. All right, anything else on this before we move on to 18? All right, 18. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. If you would look over at 1 Peter 1:5. 1 Peter 1, verse 5. And this is my nightmare, to get up here and not know somebody's name. I'm terrible. Help me out. Scott. Okay, I'm sorry. I've had bad dreams about this in the past, and it just happened. So, all right, Scott. I can tell you this: I probably will never forget it again. All right, Scott, if you would read 1 Peter 1, verse 5 for us.
Who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time.
All right. So God brought us forth, and he's giving us that salvation. And as we talked about in 18, that word of truth. What's that word of truth that we just read there in 1 Peter 1:5? The salvation that's going to be revealed in the last time. So, all right. And then getting into verse 19 and 20. Amy, if you would read both of those for us, please.
So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Okay. So this is a very, very good lesson. And I know one that I could really take something from. So how does one overcome temptation? What do we just read here? Okay. Now we're going to flip over to EJ. You mind reading for us? So we're going to look over at Proverbs. And everybody just flip over there. We'll probably spend the last 5 minutes here in Proverbs, chapter 10. And verse 19, when you get it for us, EJ. You're good. Proverbs 10:19. 10:19, yes, ma'am.
Okay, in the multitude of the words, there is one is not set, but he that refrains his own lips is wise.
Okay, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. What's that mean? Amy?
For some people, the more words you say, the more opportunity you give yourself to mess up and sin.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I mean, the more you talk, the more you run the risk of putting yourself in a bad situation. Look over a couple chapters at chapter 17, Dave. Proverbs 17 and verse 27.
He who has knowledge bears his word, and the man of understanding is of a calm spirit.
All right. So somebody paraphrase that for me. Summarize that. What did we just read? He who has knowledge spares his words.
They probably listen more than speak.
Listen more than we speak. Be cautious. I mean, who wrote Proverbs? Solomon. Who was the wisest man to ever live? Solomon. You think we could take note from what he has to say? Absolutely. And so he who has knowledge, he says, someone that's got knowledge, someone that's smart, they're not going to say a whole lot. They're going to sit back and listen mostly. All right, flip back a couple of chapters to chapter 14 and verse 17. Mr. Warren, if you would read that for us, please. Proverbs 14:17. Yeah, Mr. Warren, yes. Proverbs 14:17.
17.
14:17.
A quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hateful.
Okay, so what should we kind of do? Obviously, number one, be slow to speak. What's kind of the common theme here? Quick-tempered man acts foolishly.
They probably speak before they're think it through.
Right. So the key for us is to slow it down. Don't get in such a hurry to speak. You know, we've all had conversations with somebody, or maybe we have been that person in a conversation that is so quick to speak, so quick to react that we don't even really actually pay attention to what somebody is saying to us. We've already got our next argument to throw out there at them. And the last thing here, look over at chapter 16 and verse 32. And Mark, if you would read that for us, please.
Proverbs 16:32.
Yes, sir.
He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules his spirit takes sin.
Okay. So again, the common theme we see here is being slow. Slow to speak, slow to wrath, slow to anger. Is there anything wrong with anger? Was Jesus ever angry? Do what, Nancy? Right. Did Jesus ever act on his anger? Like physical outburst of anger that we can see? Yeah. Like, and you think about that, you think about Jesus and all the things we know about him, all the things that we read about him, but one of the things that we read, imagine him in the temple, flipping over tables, like the anger that he must have felt, the anger that he must have had. And I think typically we think of Jesus with all these other issues, slow to speak. We read of him, where they ask him a question and he just pretty much ignores them. It'd have been real easy for him to come back at him with something very quick because he would have the answers and he's got the authority to give those answers. But the example he sets forth is to be slow in those things. So when he did get angry, chances are it wasn't a an instant, oh, I'm angry. Like, this is something that he probably thought through, thought about. The children have been unleashed. Probably thought through, thought about, and then acted on that and was slow with that. So that's all the time we have this morning. I appreciate everybody's thoughts and comments, and Chuck should be back next week.